Colonel Potter, sir. My last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
Try picturing the history of American comedy with one show missing from it. Hard, isn't it? Because this wasn't just another sitcom filling up a Tuesday night slot. This was a show that changed the rulebook completely. It made people laugh 1 minute and left them staring silently at the screen the next. It took a war nobody wanted to talk about and turned it into one of the most honest, most human pieces of television ever made. We're talking about MASH, the show that started in 1972 and never really let go of the culture, even decades after it ended. But here's the part most casual fans never really dig into. Behind the operating tables, the jokes, the choppers landing in the compound, there was a cast slowly falling apart at the seams. Actor after actor walked away from one of the biggest shows on television, and almost none of them left for the same reason. Some left chasing bigger dreams. Some left because the show broke their hearts in ways audiences never saw. Some left quietly, almost invisibly, while others were sent off in scenes that are still remembered as some of the most gut-wrenching moments in TV history. So today we're pulling back the curtain on why these actors actually left MASH, and trust me, some of these stories are far messier than anything that ever aired on screen. Before we get into the exits, it's worth understanding where this whole thing came from, because the road to MASH is honestly stranger than fiction. It all started with a novel written by a man named H. Richard Hornberger, who published his book under the pen name Richard Hooker back in 1968. Hornberger wasn't just some writer with an active imagination, he had actually served as a surgeon in a mobile army hospital during the Korean War, and his novel was basically a fictionalized diary of everything he witnessed and lived through. The book combined dark humor with brutal honesty about what war does to people, and it sold well enough to catch Hollywood's eye almost immediately. Just 2 years later, director Robert Altman turned the novel into a film, and it hit theaters at the perfect, or maybe the most painful, moment in American history, right as the Vietnam War was dragging on and dividing the country. The movie starred Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould, and it wasn't just successful, it was a cultural gut punch. It won major awards, it got people talking, and it proved that audiences were ready for a war story that didn't glorify anything. 2 years after that, CBS decided to gamble on turning the film into a weekly series. Writers Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds took the reins, and on September 17, 1972, the television version of MASH went live for the first time. It kept the setting, kept the dark comedy, but leaned much harder into character development and long-term storytelling, something television hadn't really attempted at that scale before. Alan Alda took on the role of Hawkeye Pierce, and almost instantly, he became the anchor the entire show would eventually revolve around. Now here's something a lot of people forget. MASH almost didn't survive its first season. The ratings were rough, so rough that cancellation was a real possibility. CBS took a risk, shifted its time slot to Saturday nights, and that one decision changed everything. Viewership exploded, and the show quickly became one of the most talked about programs on television. It broke conventions left and right. It used actual combat footage. It refused to use a laugh track, choosing instead the sound of helicopters landing to set the emotional tone. It was raw in a way sitcoms simply weren't supposed to be. As the show grew more ambitious, Alan Alda grew right along with it, eventually stepping into writing and directing roles, pushing the series toward heavier, more emotionally complex storytelling. And that shift, more than anything else, is where the tension behind the scenes really started brewing. As the show deepened, some actors felt like they were expanding alongside it. Others felt like they were shrinking, fading into the background of a story that used to belong to all of them equally. Over 11 seasons, the cast changed again and again, and every single departure tells its own story about ambition, heartbreak, exhaustion, or simply outgrowing a role that once meant everything. Let's start with the exit that still gives longtime fans chills whenever it comes up, because it wasn't just a departure, it was a moment that rewrote what television was allowed to do. McLean Stevenson played Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, the bumbling, warm-hearted commanding officer who somehow held the whole unit together despite being constantly out of his depth. Where Hawkeye brought sarcasm and rebellion, Henry brought a kind of clueless decency that audiences adored. Stevenson's performance earned him serious critical praise early on, including a Golden Globe, and for a while, it looked like he had one of the most beloved roles on television locked down for as long as he wanted it. But privately, McLean wasn't satisfied. The show had started as something close to an ensemble piece, but as Alan Alda's character took center stage, and as Alda himself became more involved creatively, Stevenson started to feel like a supporting player in a story that used to include him at the center. He wanted more. He wanted to headline his own show, to be the lead rather than the reliable comic relief standing beside the real star. So at the end of season 3, he made the decision to leave, hoping it would launch him into bigger, brighter opportunities. What happened next became one of the most talked about moments in the history of American television. Instead of writing Henry Blake off with a gentle goodbye, a transfer, or a quiet retirement, the writers chose something far bolder. They wanted to remind viewers that this show, underneath all the jokes, was still about war, and in war, not everyone comes home. So they crafted an episode that let Henry Blake finally get his discharge, celebrate with his unit, say his tearful goodbyes, and head off toward what felt like a well-earned happy ending. Then, in the final scene, everything shattered. Radar walks into the operating room mid-surgery, visibly shaken, and delivers the news that Henry's plane went down over open water with no survivors. There's no music. No dramatic build-up. Just silence, shock, and the sound of surgical equipment. It was one of the first times a network sitcom killed off a major character permanently, without warning, and audiences felt every bit of it. Interestingly, most of the cast didn't know the ending was coming. Only the actor playing Radar had been told in advance so his reaction could be genuine on camera, which is part of why that scene still hits so hard decades later. The public reaction was intense. CBS was flooded with letters, some praising the bravery of the choice, others furious that a character they loved had been taken from them so suddenly. The writers stood firmly behind their decision, insisting that the moment mattered precisely because it hurt. As for McLean himself, his post-MASH career didn't go the way he'd hoped. He landed a new deal and starred in a couple of sitcoms built around his own persona, but neither one connected with audiences, and both were cancelled fairly quickly. In later interviews, he admitted with real regret that leaving MASH had been a mistake, acknowledging that he had walked away from something genuinely special while chasing something that never quite materialized. Despite the disappointment, he continued working steadily in television until his passing in the mid-90s, remembered by castmates as warm, funny, and deeply talented. In many ways, his departure gave the show its emotional backbone, ironic considering it was the very thing he hoped would set him free. If Stevenson's exit was loud and unforgettable, Wayne Rogers' departure was the complete opposite, quiet, sudden, and almost eerily unresolved. Wayne played trapper John McIntyre, one half of the mischievous duo that defined the show's earliest identity. Alongside Hawkeye, Trapper brought fast-talking banter, rule-breaking energy, and a friendship that instantly clicked with viewers. The chemistry between the two actors felt effortless, almost like watching two old friends improvising their way through chaos. But behind that easy chemistry, Wayne had signed on expecting something closer to a true ensemble show, one where screen time and character development would be spread evenly. As the series evolved, and as Hawkeye increasingly became the emotional and moral center of the story, Trapper's role started shrinking into something far less substantial. Wayne later described the frustration bluntly, explaining that his character had gone from being an equal partner to little more than someone reacting to whatever Hawkeye said or did. Unlike Stevenson, Wayne didn't announce a dramatic exit or negotiate a farewell arc. He simply chose not to renew when his contract ended after season 3, and the production team reportedly didn't even realize he was gone until shortly before the next season began filming. To make things even messier, it turned out his contract had never technically been finalized in writing, meaning any threat of legal action against him had no real ground to stand on. He had walked away clean, whether the producers liked it or not. His sudden absence forced the writers to scramble. They opened the following season by explaining that Trapper had been discharged while Hawkeye happened to be away, giving fans no farewell scene, no goodbye party, nothing resembling closure. Audiences were stunned. First Henry, and now Trapper too. It felt like the show's foundation was shifting beneath their feet. Into that gap stepped Mike Farrell as B.J. Honeycutt, a calmer, more emotionally grounded character who shifted the tone of the series in a noticeably different direction. Interestingly, many people would later argue that MASH actually grew more mature and more emotionally resonant after this shift, even if the early buddy comedy energy was never quite replicated. As for Wayne, his life after MASH took an unexpected turn. Rather than chasing more acting roles, he leaned into his background in history and eventually built an entirely new career as a financial investor, becoming a familiar face on business television discussing markets and economics. Despite the abruptness of his exit, there didn't seem to be any lingering resentment between him and his former castmates. Alan Alda spoke fondly of him for years afterward, and when Wayne passed away in 2015, tributes from the cast reflected genuine affection rather than old grudges. He may have left without fanfare, but Trapper John remains one of the most fondly remembered characters from the show's early run. Now let's talk about someone whose exit wasn't about ambition or ego at all, but about something far more personal and, frankly, more painful. Gary Burghoff played Radar O'Reilly, the soft-spoken company clerk with an almost supernatural ability to sense incoming helicopters before anyone else could hear them. Radar carried a childlike innocence that somehow made the horrors around him feel a little more bearable, both for the characters and for the audience watching at home. Gary was actually the only actor to reprise his role directly from the original film, and he reshaped that character into something far gentler and more layered than the source material ever suggested. But off-camera, Gary was struggling. The demanding production schedule, combined with his own perfectionism, gradually wore him down. He dealt with real struggles involving anxiety and depression, something rarely discussed openly at the time, and it deeply affected how he coped with the pressures of the job. On top of that, he was constantly away from his young family, missing years of his daughter's early life in a way he later admitted he deeply regretted. Castmates recalled that he often felt underappreciated, even though those around him respected him far more than he seemed to realize. There were also ongoing disputes over pay, scheduling, and how much screen time he wanted, and while producers tried to accommodate him with reduced appearances and more flexibility, it wasn't enough to keep him fulfilled. Emotionally, he had reached his limit. So by season 8, Gary made the difficult choice to step away for good. Unlike Wayne's quiet disappearance, Radar was given a proper send-off, a 2-part farewell arc that ranks among the most emotional storylines the show ever produced. In it, Radar returns from leave to find the unit falling apart without him, tries desperately to fix everything the way he always had, and slowly comes to accept that it's finally time to go home and take care of his family and his community. The final image, Radar walking away alone under the Korean sky, having left his teddy bear behind, remains one of the most quietly devastating moments in the show's history. It didn't need dialogue to hit hard. It just needed silence. After MASH, Gary largely stepped back from the spotlight. A short-lived spin-off didn't take off the way anyone hoped, and eventually he chose to walk away from Hollywood altogether, dedicating himself instead to painting, wildlife conservation, and even inventing, holding several patents along the way. He later explained that he left for 2 simple reasons, his family and burnout, wanting nothing more than to rebuild the life he felt he had been missing. Today he lives a mostly private life, rarely appearing publicly, but fans who do encounter him still remember him as the gentle heart of the 4077th. Next, let's talk about the man who played one of television's most entertainingly insufferable villains. Larry Linville brought Major Frank Burns to life, a rigid, self-righteous, endlessly petty character whose secret affair and constant need for approval made him the perfect punching bag for Hawkeye and Trapper. Audiences loved hating him, and for the show's first several seasons, that dynamic worked beautifully. But as MASH matured and its other characters became more nuanced, Frank remained frozen in place, a one-dimensional source of comic relief in a show that was rapidly outgrowing that kind of simplicity. Larry, an actor capable of far more range than his role allowed him to show, began to feel the limitations of the character weighing on him. By the end of season 5, he made the decision not to renew his contract, later explaining that he felt he had taken Frank Burns as far as the character could realistically go. His departure wasn't dramatic or bitter. It was almost a natural conclusion, and it ended up benefiting the show creatively. With Frank gone, MASH no longer needed a cartoonish antagonist to generate conflict. It could instead lean into moral complexity and irony, something that arguably helped elevate the series from great to legendary. Frank's exit was handled off-screen, framed as a convenient promotion, and while it wasn't mourned within the story itself, long-time viewers definitely felt the shift in tone. Larry continued working in television afterward, but he never landed another role quite as recognizable as Frank Burns. Interestingly, the character brought in to replace him ended up being just as compelling, if not more so, and his departure came under entirely different circumstances. David Ogden Stiers stepped into the role of Charles Emerson Winchester III in Season 6, and where Frank had been a cartoon, Winchester was a slow burn. Cultured, arrogant, and deeply guarded, he wasn't written to be an easy villain. He was written to challenge everyone around him, including the audience's assumptions about who deserved sympathy. At first, Winchester came across as insufferably pompous, but over time, cracks began to show beneath his polished exterior. He wasn't cruel. He was proud, and privately, he was just as affected by the horrors of war as anyone else, even if he refused to show it. Stiers played the role with remarkable restraint, and unlike several of his castmates, he chose to stay with the show until its very final episode, exiting on his own terms with a sense of poetic closure rather than mid-series frustration. One of his final scenes, teaching prisoners of war to play classical music, remains one of the most quietly beautiful moments in the show's history. When offered a role in the spin-off that followed MASH, David turned it down, feeling that Winchester's story had reached its natural conclusion and didn't need to continue. After the show ended, he became a familiar voice in animated films, and in 2009, he publicly shared that he was gay, explaining that he had kept that part of his life private earlier in his career out of genuine concern that it could damage his opportunities in the industry. He passed away in 2018, remembered not only for his tremendous range as an actor but for the quiet courage it took to live openly later in life. Before wrapping things up, it's worth giving proper credit to the women who helped carry MASH through all 11 seasons, because their journeys were just as significant, even if they were often overshadowed in the conversation. Loretta Swit played Major Margaret Houlihan, a character who started out as little more than a punchline built around a crude nickname from the original film. But Loretta refused to let her stay that way. Season after season, she pushed to give Margaret depth, strength, and vulnerability, slowly transforming her from comic relief into one of the most respected characters on the show. By the time the series ended, Margaret had become a decorated, deeply human officer who openly questioned the cruelty of war while still performing her duties with total precision. Remarkably, Loretta remained with the show for its entire run, one of only a handful of actors to appear in both the very first episode and the very last. While other female characters came and went throughout the series, Margaret stayed, evolved, and ultimately proved that even in a story dominated by its male leads, there was room for a character who refused to be sidelined. So there you have it, the real reasons behind some of the most significant departures in MASH history. Some actors left chasing bigger dreams that never fully paid off. Some left quietly, protecting their peace after years of personal struggle. Some simply outgrew the roles that once defined them, and some stayed until the very end, choosing closure over ambition. What's fascinating is that even with all these departures, all these behind-the-scenes tensions, MASH never lost its emotional core. If anything, every exit reshaped the show in a way that made it richer, more layered, and more human. Which one of these stories surprised you the most? Drop your thoughts down below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one.